Hundreds of people moved through downtown Chicago, as if the city had trained them to ignore pain. Morning rain glazed the sidewalks, turning the glass towers into blurred walls of silver and gray. Businessmen hurried past with coffee in one hand and phones pressed to their ears. Tourists laughed beneath umbrellas. Cars hissed along Michigan Avenue, their headlights cutting through the cold mist. And in the middle of all that noise stood Sienna Brooks, 25 years old, shaking so badly she could barely hold the strap of her worn leather purse. She had spent the last 3 weeks trying to become invisible. After escaping Cartervale, the man who had slowly turned her heart into a locked room, Sienna had changed her number, left their apartment, and moved into a tiny studio above a laundromat in Wicker Park. She told herself she was free. But freedom did not feel safe when every sound behind her made her chest tighten. It did not feel like peace when she still checked every reflection in every window, terrified she would see his face watching her from the crowd. Her childhood had taught her abandonment before love ever had the chance to stay. Her mother left when she was 8. Her father stayed, but only in body, silent and cold, a man who looked through her like she was furniture. Carter had found every fragile place inside her and called it devotion. He controlled her clothes, her friends, her money, her breathing. By the time she escaped, Sienna no longer knew whether fear was a warning or simply the way her body remembered being owned. That morning, she had come downtown for a job interview at a luxury hotel near the river. She wore her only good black dress beneath an old beige coat, her hair pinned neatly despite the rain. Her resume, tucked inside a folder she had protected like a passport to another life. She needed this job. Her rent was overdue. Her bank account held $43. Her refrigerator contained half a carton of milk and a bruised apple. Survival had become a quiet war fought with trembling hands and forced smiles. Then Carter's sister found her outside the hotel entrance. Vanessa Vale stepped from a black SUV in cream cashmere, diamond earrings flashing beneath the gray sky. 2 of Carter's friends stood behind her, not touching Sienna, not threatening her aloud, but close enough to make the air shrink. Vanessa's smile was sharp, polished, cruel. "There she is," Vanessa said, loud enough for people to hear. "The runaway liar." Sienna froze. The crowd slowed, then widened around them. Not enough to help, just enough to watch. Vanessa's voice rose with theatrical disgust, painting Sienna as unstable, ungrateful, dramatic. She spoke of debt Sienna did not owe, loyalty Sienna had supposedly betrayed, love Sienna had destroyed. Every sentence was designed like a blade, not to wound the skin, but to reopen the places Carter had already broken. People stared. A woman looked at Sienna's shaking hands, then quickly looked away. A man in a navy suit frowned, hesitated, and walked on. Sienna tried to speak, but her throat closed. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it was begging to escape her ribs. The city spun around her. Rain gathered on her lashes. Her folders slipped from her fingers, papers scattering across the wet sidewalk. Vanessa laughed softly, and that sound broke something inside her. Sienna bent down, trying to collect the ruined resumes, but her knees weakened. She could feel everyone watching now. She could feel the old terror rising, whispering that she was alone, hunted, powerless, easy to erase. She was not a victim, she told herself desperately, but the words had no strength yet. Not here, not with the crowd looking through her like her pain was an inconvenience. Across the street, a black Rolls-Royce stopped at the curb. Damian Cross stepped out without hurry. Chicago knew his name in whispers. Billionaire, syndicate king, a man whose empire stretched from private clubs to shipping routes, from penthouses to politicians who smiled too nervously when he entered a room. He wore a charcoal overcoat, black leather gloves, and the kind of silence that made powerful men reconsider their breathing. Damian had seen the whole thing. He crossed through traffic as if the city belonged to him, his dark eyes fixed on Sienna, not Vanessa, not the staring crowd. He reached her just as she tried to stand and failed. Without touching her, he positioned himself between her and everyone hurting her. The crowd went still. Vanessa's face lost its color. Damien looked down at Sienna, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You're safe now." Then he lifted his gaze to the people around them, and every whisper died. Powerful men avoided unnecessary problems. They avoided chaos, drama, and emotional storms that offered no strategic advantage. Damien Kane had spent 20 years building an empire by following that rule. Every alliance, every investment, every war he fought was calculated with ruthless precision. Yet as his convoy moved through Chicago that afternoon, his thoughts remained fixed on a trembling woman standing alone in the rain. It irritated him, because Sienna Brooks should have become nothing more than a forgotten moment. Instead, she lingered. The video had already spread across social media. Hundreds of thousands of views within hours. Footage showed a terrified young woman surrounded by public humiliation before Damien Kane stepped beside her. The clip ended the moment people recognized him. Comments exploded beneath every repost. Some focused on Sienna, most focused on Damien. The King of Chicago had chosen a side, and nobody understood why. From the top floor of Kane Tower, Damien stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he quietly controlled. Publicly, he was a billionaire businessman whose companies dominated real estate, logistics, luxury hotels, and private investment firms. Newspapers called him visionary. Investors called him untouchable. The truth was far more dangerous. Behind closed doors, Damien Kane ruled the Chicago syndicate, an empire built on loyalty, information, influence, and absolute control. Politicians feared him. Corporate rivals respected him. Enemies disappeared from conversations long before they became threats. At 38, Damien had become the kind of man people whispered about rather than spoke to directly. Yet now a woman with frightened eyes occupied space in his mind that should have been reserved for business. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus entered without hesitation. As Damien's closest advisor, he was one of the few people allowed such privilege. "We looked into her," Marcus said. Damien turned slowly, and Marcus placed a file on the desk. Sienna Brooks, 25. No criminal history. No financial fraud. No hidden agenda. Damien opened the file. A photograph stared back at him. Even smiling, her eyes carried sadness. The kind that didn't disappear after a good night's sleep. The kind that lived deep beneath the surface. He continued reading. Each page painted a clearer picture. Frequent address changes. Isolation from friends. Employment gaps. Medical records showing anxiety treatment. Witness statements from former co-workers describing a controlling boyfriend who monitored her constantly without ever crossing legal lines. Nothing dramatic. Nothing criminal enough to attract authorities. Just years of emotional control disguised as love. Damien's jaw tightened. He had spent his life studying power. He understood that not every prison had walls. Some were built with guilt, others with fear. And according to everything in front of him, Sienna Brooks had spent years trapped inside both. She left 3 weeks ago. Marcus continued quietly. Since then, she's been trying to disappear. Damien looked back toward the skyline. The city stretched endlessly beneath dark clouds. Most people believed power meant forcing others to obey. They were wrong. Real power meant creating safety. Real control meant deciding who could threaten the people under your protection. The realization unsettled him, because somewhere between the rain-soaked sidewalk and this moment, his instincts had shifted. Without permission, without logic, without strategy. Protect her. The thought arrived with uncomfortable certainty. Not because she was weak, not because she needed saving. Sienna wasn't a victim. She had survived things that broke stronger people. But survival wasn't the same as feeling safe. For the first time in years, Damien found himself wondering what safety looked like through someone else's eyes. Across the city, Sienna sat alone inside her apartment, watching news clips she wished she had never seen. Every channel carried some version of the story. The mysterious woman, the public confrontation, the feared billionaire who stepped in, and finally his name, Damien Kane. Her stomach tightened each time she heard it. Fear and curiosity collided inside her chest. She searched his name online. Articles described success, influence, luxury, power. Yet beneath the polished headlines were whispers, rumors, stories nobody could prove, stories that made her heart pound harder. Who was he really? And why had he helped her? Meanwhile, 40 stories above Chicago, Damien received another update. This one changed everything. Marcus placed a second file on the desk. There's something else. Damien looked up. Marcus rarely sounded concerned. He isn't letting go. Damien's eyes narrowed. Carter Vale. Marcus nodded. We intercepted information an hour ago. The room became very still. Marcus slid several photographs forward. Private investigators. Background searches. Apartment inquiries. Employment records. Carter had already started looking for her. Actively. Methodically. Obsessively. Damien stared at the evidence for several silent seconds. Then something cold settled behind his eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Calculation. Because this was no longer about a public incident. This was becoming a hunt. And for the first time, Damien Kane realized someone was searching for a woman he had already decided to protect. The King of Chicago slowly closed the file. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, a far more dangerous storm was beginning. Sienna thought leaving was the hardest part. She was wrong. Leaving had only been the beginning. The real nightmare started when she realized Ethan Mercer had never viewed their relationship as something that could end. In his mind, people did not leave him. They belonged to him. And anything that belonged to him eventually came back. The realization arrived slowly, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. 3 days after the incident downtown, Sienna sat alone inside her small apartment, staring at an email she had received 20 minutes earlier. There was no message, no threat, no explanation, only a photograph. A recent photograph. Her neighborhood grocery store. The coffee shop she visited every Tuesday. The bus stopped 2 blocks from her apartment. Her pulse immediately accelerated. Heart pounding. Breath shallow. Fear returned with terrifying familiarity. She deleted the email. Then she checked the locks on her door twice. Then 3 times. By midnight, she was sitting on her couch with every light turned on. Because she knew exactly who had sent it. Ethan Mercer. The man the world admired. The man she secretly feared. Ethan was 32, wealthy, charismatic, and remarkably skilled at convincing people he was kind. He owned luxury marketing firms across Chicago and regularly appeared in business magazines discussing leadership and innovation. Employees adored him. Investors trusted him. But Sienna knew the version nobody else saw. The version hidden behind closed doors. The version that never shouted, never threatened, never needed to, because control was always more effective when disguised as love. At first, he wanted access to her calendar, then her passwords, then her finances. Soon, every decision required his approval. What restaurant she visited, which coworker she spoke to, why she answered certain text messages, why she took too long returning home. Every conversation became an interrogation disguised as concern. Every apology became a contract. Every act of affection came with invisible strings attached. By the time she recognized what was happening, most of her friendships had quietly disappeared. Ethan never demanded she cut people off. He simply convinced her everyone else was dangerous. Everyone else would leave. Everyone else would betray her. Only he remained. Only he understood. Only he cared. The prison had never required locked doors. It only required isolation. Now, sitting alone in her apartment, Sienna realized how deeply those fears still lived inside her. Part of her wanted to run again. Change apartments. Change jobs. Disappear completely. The other part was exhausted. Tired of hiding. Tired of surviving. Tired of living as if she were permanently hunted. Across the city, Damien Kane was learning truths that made him increasingly uneasy. His private office remained silent except for the soft turning of pages. Every report revealed another layer of Ethan Mercer. Nothing criminal. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would attract legal attention. Which somehow made it worse. Because Ethan understood boundaries well enough to stay inside them while still controlling everything around him. Damien reviewed statements from former assistants, former employees, former friends. Patterns emerged. People drifted away from Ethan after becoming emotionally dependent on his approval. Relationships ended with confusion rather than closure. Individuals described feeling monitored without evidence, watched without proof, managed without permission. A man obsessed with ownership, a man addicted to control. Damien leaned back in his chair. His instincts rarely failed him, and every instinct was telling him the same thing. Danger. Not physical danger. Something colder. Something quieter. The kind that slowly erased a person's confidence until they no longer trusted their own thoughts. For the first time in years, Damien felt something personal entering his decision-making. He should have remained detached, strategic, objective. Instead, he found himself wondering whether Sienna had slept at all, whether she felt safe, whether anyone had ever stood between her and the fear she carried. The questions irritated him, but they remained. Later that evening, Sienna received a call from an unknown number. She ignored it. The phone rang again, then again, then again. Finally, it stopped. A text arrived moments later. 3 words. "I miss you." Her stomach twisted instantly. No signature, no explanation. None was needed. Ethan had always known exactly how little effort was required to make her afraid. For several minutes, she simply stared at the screen. Then, slowly, something unexpected happened. The fear remained, but beneath it came anger. Small, fragile, growing, because she was beginning to understand something important. She was not a victim. She had escaped. She had survived. And somewhere deep inside, the frightened woman staring at that message was someone stronger than Ethan ever wanted her to become. Meanwhile, 40 stories above Chicago, Damien received a call from Marcus. The concern in his voice was immediate. "We have a problem." Damien stood. "What happened?" Several seconds of silence followed. Then Marcus answered. "We traced Ethan's latest activity." Damien's expression hardened. "And?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "He knows where she lives." The room fell silent. Outside, Chicago glittered beneath the night sky. Inside, the king of the city's shadow empire stared toward the darkness beyond the glass. Because the hunt was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. For years, Chicago feared Damien Kane. His name traveled through boardrooms, luxury penthouses, private clubs, and whispered conversations that stopped the moment he entered a room. People respected his power. They feared his control. They admired the empire he had built from nothing. Yet none of those people would have recognized the man he was slowly becoming. Because while the city watched a king rule an empire, Damien found himself focused on protecting one woman who didn't even realize how much of his attention she occupied. After learning Ethan knew Sienna's location, Damien acted quietly. No announcements, no dramatic confrontations, no public displays of power. 2 security specialists rented apartments across from Sienna's building under completely different identities. Cameras appeared near entrances that previously had none. The broken streetlight outside her block was repaired within 24 hours. Her routes to work became monitored without her knowledge. The protection remained invisible. The goal was simple, safe. For the first time in months, someone was building safety around her without asking for anything in return. Sienna noticed small changes but couldn't explain them. The neighborhood suddenly felt different. The constant anxiety that had followed her everywhere began easing slightly. She still checked over her shoulder. She still felt hunted sometimes. But the overwhelming sense of danger no longer controlled every moment of her day. Then Damien called. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Nothing extraordinary was discussed. Weather, work, Chicago traffic. Yet after hanging up, Sienna realized it had been the first conversation in years where she never felt judged, managed, corrected, or controlled. That realization stayed with her. The calls continued, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 20. Neither acknowledged how much they were beginning to rely on them. Sienna learned that Damien preferred late evenings because the city became quieter. Damien learned that Sienna secretly loved architecture and often walked downtown simply to admire old buildings. He learned she collected secondhand novels. He learned she always apologized before expressing an opinion because somewhere along the way she had been taught her voice required permission. Every discovery tightened something inside his chest. Not ownership, not possession, something far more dangerous. Care. One evening, rain tapped softly against Sienna's apartment windows while she sat curled on her couch speaking to Damien. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked unexpectedly. Silence followed. Most people assumed powerful men never experience loneliness. They were wrong. Damien stood inside his penthouse overlooking a city filled with millions of people, and he had never felt more understood by anyone than he did in that moment. "Every day," he admitted quietly. The honesty surprised both of them. Sienna stared toward the dark window. "So do I." The words settled between them. Close, personal, real. For the first time, neither felt alone. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly. A conversation here, a shared silence there, a growing certainty that neither needed to pretend. Sienna began seeing the man behind the reputation, the king behind the empire, the protector beneath the power. And Damien saw something equally unexpected. Strength. Because despite everything Ethan had done, despite the fear, despite the emotional scars, Sienna continued moving forward. She was not a victim. She was surviving a war nobody else could see. Meanwhile, changes inside the syndicate became impossible to ignore. Meetings ended early because Damien had somewhere else to be. Phone calls were occasionally interrupted by messages from Sienna. His mood improved. His patience increased. The entire organization noticed. Marcus noticed most of all. "You care about her," he said one night. Damien looked up from a report. "That's not your concern." Marcus smiled slightly. The answer told him everything. Elsewhere, Sienna was beginning to experience something unfamiliar. Peace. Not complete peace. Not permanent peace. But enough to remember what breathing felt like when fear wasn't wrapped around every thought. Then everything changed. On a quiet Thursday evening, an unmarked envelope appeared beneath her apartment door. No return address. No explanation. Heart pounding, she opened it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of her leaving work, buying groceries, waiting for buses, walking home, sitting alone in coffee shops. Some photographs were weeks old. Others were months old. One image was dated almost a year earlier, long before she escaped Ethan, long before she realized she was being watched. Her breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. At the bottom of the stack rested a handwritten note. Only 6 words. "I always know where you are." Sienna's hands began shaking uncontrollably, because the photographs proved something terrifying. Someone had been secretly watching her for months. And suddenly, every safe place she thought she had found felt dangerously exposed. The safest place in Chicago wasn't a police station, a courthouse, or a luxury penthouse. It was the private estate of the man everyone feared. Sienna realized that the moment Damien's security team escorted her through the massive iron gates overlooking Lake Michigan, the estate felt less like a home and more like a hidden kingdom. Acres of private land stretched along the shoreline. Stone pathways wound through manicured gardens illuminated by soft golden lights. Ancient oak trees stood like silent guardians around the property. Beyond them rose the mansion itself, a breathtaking structure of glass, limestone, and understated luxury. Nothing about it felt loud. Nothing felt designed to impress. It felt designed to protect. For someone who had spent years living in fear, the difference was impossible to ignore. After the photographs arrived at her apartment, Damien had given her a choice. Not an order, not a demand. A choice. Stay where she was and continue looking over her shoulder every night. Or come somewhere safe until they understood how serious the situation had become. Sienna had resisted initially. Trust still frightened her. Dependence frightened her even more. But as she stood inside the estate's grand entrance, watching staff members greet her with warm professionalism instead of judgment, she felt something unfamiliar. Relief. The staff already knew her name. Not because Damien had instructed them to treat her as a guest, because he had quietly made sure they understood she was important. Mrs. Whitaker, the estate manager, guided her through the residence with grandmotherly warmth. The woman had managed Damien's household for nearly 15 years and carried herself with calm authority. "You'll find everyone here protective of their own," she explained with a gentle smile. Their own. The words lingered. Sienna had spent so many years feeling disposable that belonging somewhere felt almost impossible to imagine. Her suite overlooked the lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected endless water and sky. Fresh flowers rested beside a reading chair. Shelves contained novels she loved. A small basket of tea waited on the table. Every detail felt thoughtful. Every detail felt seen. That night she sat beside the window long after sunset, watching moonlight dance across the water. For the first time in years, her heart wasn't racing. For the first time in years, she slept without checking every lock twice. Meanwhile, Damien watched those changes quietly. He never mentioned them, never pointed them out, but he noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she smiled more often, the way she gradually stopped apologizing for existing. Weeks passed. Morning walks through the gardens became routine. Conversations stretched longer. Laughter appeared unexpectedly. Healing arrived slowly, like sunlight returning after a brutal winter. The estate itself seemed determined to help. Gardeners shared stories. Kitchen staff saved her favorite desserts. Security teams greeted her respectfully every morning. The entire environment felt strangely close, like a family assembled from loyalty rather than blood. A found family, something neither Damien nor Sienna had expected. For Damien, the changes became impossible to ignore. His empire still demanded attention. Meetings continued. Business expanded. The king still ruled. Yet his favorite part of every day became returning home. Because for the first time in years, the mansion no longer felt empty. Syndicate members noticed immediately. Marcus noticed most. One evening, he joined Damien on the terrace overlooking the lake. "You've changed," Marcus observed. Damien didn't look away from the water. "People say that when they don't understand something." Marcus smiled. "No, people say that when they're watching someone become human again." The comment remained unanswered, because Damien wasn't entirely sure Marcus was wrong. Sienna was changing too. The frightened woman who arrived at the estate wasn't disappearing. She was evolving. Confidence slowly returned. She began volunteering remotely for local support organizations. She accepted a consulting position through one of Damien's corporate connections. She stopped defining herself through survival. She was not a victim. She became powerful in quieter ways. And every step forward strengthened something between them neither was ready to name. Trust, loyalty, attachment, something deeper, something dangerous. One rainy afternoon, everything shifted. Sienna was searching for a notebook Damien had offered to lend her from his private library. The room sat in a quiet wing of the mansion, lined with dark wood shelves and overlooking the lake. As she searched, a partially open drawer caught her attention. She should have ignored it. Instead, curiosity won. Inside rested several folders. Her name appeared on every one. Sienna Brooks. Heart pounding instantly. She pulled one file free, then another. Employment history, housing records, background reports, timeline summaries, photographs, pages and pages of information. Her breath caught. The earliest report carried a date. The day they met. Not weeks later. Not after the threats escalated. The very first day, Damien had been investigating her from the beginning. Every page confirmed it. Every page raised new questions. Fear mixed with confusion. Confusion mixed with betrayal. The man she had started trusting more than anyone else had been quietly learning everything about her from the shadows. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. Inside the library, Sienna stared at the files spread across the desk. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, she wasn't sure whether she had discovered protection or another kind of control. The most dangerous betrayals rarely come from enemies. They come from people who already have access to everything. Sienna stood alone inside Damien's library long after discovering the files. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Lake Michigan, but the peaceful sound did nothing to quiet the storm building inside her chest. Every report spread across the desk felt like evidence against a man she had trusted. Heart pounding, breath uneven, questions multiplying. She had finally begun believing she was safe. Now she wondered whether she had simply stepped from one form of control into another. When Damien entered the library later that evening, he immediately understood something was wrong. The files rested open. Sienna stood beside them, silent, hurt. For several seconds, neither spoke. The distance between them felt larger than the entire estate. "You investigated me." The words were quiet, but they carried disappointment far heavier than anger. Damien looked at the documents, then back at her. Yes. No excuses. No lies. No attempt to hide the truth. Sienna stared at him in disbelief. "You knew everything. I needed to know whether you were in danger." The answer only deepened the ache inside her. Because part of her understood, part of her didn't. For years, Ethan had justified every invasion of privacy as concern, every act of control as protection. Now she found herself questioning everything again. Damien saw the conflict immediately. The fear, the uncertainty, the old wounds reopening. For the first time since they met, the King of Chicago looked vulnerable. Not powerful, not untouchable, just honest. "When I met you," he said quietly, "I saw someone being publicly cornered by people who wanted power over her. I needed facts before I could help." Sienna looked away. That's exactly what Ethan always said. The words struck harder than any accusation, because Damien understood why she said them, and because a small part of him feared she might be right. The silence stretched. Then Damien did something nobody in his empire had ever seen. He chose transparency over control. He opened every file, every report, every investigation. Nothing hidden, nothing withheld. He explained who gathered the information, why they gathered it, when each report was created. He answered every question without hesitation. The process lasted hours. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Not repaired, not healed, but clearer. For the first time, Sienna realized there was a difference between someone gathering information to own her and someone gathering information to protect her. The distinction was small, yet enormous. Still, trust had been damaged, and rebuilding it would take time. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside Damien's empire, a far more dangerous discovery emerged. Marcus arrived shortly after midnight, carrying a tablet and an expression Damien rarely saw. Concern. Real concern. "We found the leak." The room immediately grew still. For weeks, they had suspected someone inside the syndicate was feeding information outward. Someone with access. Someone trusted. Someone invisible. Marcus placed several encrypted communications on the desk. The evidence was undeniable. Information about security movements, property schedules, travel records, personal details, all flowing to the same destination. Ethan Mercer. Sienna felt her stomach tighten. Damien's expression hardened, not with anger, with disappointment, because loyalty mattered more than money inside his organization, more than influence, more than power. Loyalty was the foundation beneath the entire empire, and someone had betrayed it. Who? Damien asked quietly. Marcus hesitated. That hesitation revealed everything. The answer hurt. One of Damien's longest-serving associates. A man trusted for years. A man welcomed into private meetings. A man who understood the inner workings of the empire better than most. Nobody spoke for several moments. The realization settled heavily across the room. The threat had never been outside. It had been inside all along. Fear returned. Not the fear of strangers. The fear of betrayal. Because betrayal always stood closer. The following days transformed the estate. Not into chaos, into caution. Conversations became quieter. Security reviews increased. Questions spread through the organization. Who could still be trusted? Who already knew too much? The king found himself fighting a war within his own walls. A war of loyalty. A war of information. A war no outsider could see. Yet through all of it, Damien remained focused on one priority. Protect Sienna, no matter what happened inside the empire. No matter who betrayed him. No matter how complicated things became. She remained the line he refused to let anyone cross. For the first time, Sienna saw exactly what that commitment cost him. And for the first time, she began believing it was real. Not ownership, not control, protection. Something warm slowly returned between them. Fragile, careful, growing. Neither noticed the final move already unfolding elsewhere. Because the traitor had not stopped. He had simply adapted. Late that night, while the estate slept beneath the glow of security lights and lakefront fog, a single encrypted message left an untraceable device. Attached to it was a detailed map, gate coordinates, security rotations, private access routes, and one final piece of information: Sienna Brooks' exact location inside Damian Kane's estate. The message arrived directly in Ethan Mercer's hands. Miles away, Ethan stared at the screen, then smiled, because after months of searching, the woman who escaped him was no longer hidden. He knew exactly where she was. For years, Sienna survived by staying quiet. She learned that silence avoided arguments. Silence prevented attention. Silence kept fragile peace alive. Every time she swallowed her opinion, ignored her instincts, or accepted things that hurt her, she convinced herself she was surviving. The truth was much harsher. Silence had protected everyone except herself. The realization arrived on a gray afternoon when Ethan Mercer finally stopped hiding. The message reached her phone while she sat in the estate's glass conservatory overlooking the lake. No threats, no anger, no desperation. Just one sentence. You belong with me. You always will. Months ago, those words would have shattered her. Months ago, they would have sent her spiraling into panic. Now something different happened. Her heart still pounded. Fear still surfaced. But fear no longer controlled her. Because she finally understood something Ethan never wanted her to learn. She had survived him. And if she survived him once, she could survive him again. When Damian found her later that evening, he immediately noticed the change. Not weakness. Strength. Quiet but undeniable. The frightened woman who once apologized for taking up space now stood taller. Her eyes no longer searched for permission before speaking. Something inside her had shifted. The broken girl was disappearing. Someone stronger was emerging. Meanwhile, Ethan grew increasingly desperate. Every attempt to regain control failed. Every emotional tactic that once worked now met resistance. He sent reminders of old memories. He referenced private moments. He tried to weaponize nostalgia. He tried guilt, then concern, then regret. Every message followed the same pattern. Control disguised as love. Ownership disguised as devotion. For the first time, Sienna saw it clearly. The illusion had shattered. A few days later, she agreed to one final conversation. Not because Ethan deserved it, because she deserved closure. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. Ethan spoke first. Predictably, he blamed misunderstandings, timing, outside influences, everyone except himself. The old version of Sienna would have listened. The new version interrupted. Calmly, firmly, without fear. You never loved me, she said. Silence followed. Ethan sounded genuinely shocked, as if nobody had ever spoken those words aloud. You needed control. That's different. The statement landed harder than any accusation, because it was true. For years, Ethan built a relationship around dependence. Not partnership, not trust, dependence. And now that dependence was gone, the conversation ended moments later. Not dramatically, not emotionally, simply finished. For the first time since leaving, Sienna felt something close to freedom. True freedom. Elsewhere, Damian faced his own battle. The syndicate leak had evolved into a growing internal crisis. Several senior members argued that Sienna's situation was creating unnecessary complications. Risk, attention, distraction. From a purely strategic perspective, removing her from the equation would solve multiple problems. Damian listened to every argument, then rejected every one, without hesitation, without compromise, because some decisions mattered more than politics. Some loyalties mattered more than empire. For perhaps the first time in his leadership, the king chose a person over strategy. Marcus noticed immediately. You'd burn the entire argument to the ground for her. Damian stared across the lake. His answer came without thought. Yes. The realization surprised even him. Not because he cared, because he no longer tried denying it. Somewhere along the way, Sienna had become important. Not as a responsibility, not as someone needing protection. As herself. That truth changed everything. Trust between them slowly returned, stronger than before, built on honesty rather than assumptions. One evening they walked through the estate gardens beneath strings of golden lights. Neither rushed the silence. Neither needed to. The air felt different now. Close. Safe. Real. Sienna looked toward the water. I spent years believing I was weak. Damien glanced at her. You survived things most people never could. She smiled softly. For once, she believed him, because she was finally seeing herself clearly. She was not a victim. She became powerful, not through wealth, not through influence, through choice, through courage, through refusing to surrender her voice. The queen transformation had begun, not because someone crowned her, because she earned it. Then fate delivered something unexpected. Several days later, while reviewing archived documents connected to the syndicate investigation, Sienna noticed a familiar name buried inside older records. Ethan Mercer. At first she assumed it was coincidence. Then she kept reading. Her pulse accelerated. Heart pounding. Page after page connected Ethan to a business consulting firm that existed years earlier. A firm linked to a financial scandal that nearly collapsed one of Damien's father's companies. The same scandal that almost fractured the Kane family empire. The same betrayal Damien believed originated from outside rivals. But according to the evidence sitting in front of her, Ethan had been involved from the very beginning. Not directly, quietly, indirectly, like a shadow operating behind other people. Sienna stared at the documents. The implications were enormous. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This reached far deeper, far older, far more dangerous. And for the first time, she realized Ethan Mercer might be connected to the betrayal that nearly destroyed Damien Kane's family empire years before. A discovery that could change everything. Chicago feared Damien Kane for decades. Politicians lowered their voices when his name entered a conversation. Corporate rivals carefully measured every move around his empire. Entire industries respected the power he commanded. Yet the one person who truly changed him was not a rival king, a powerful investor, or a syndicate leader. It was the broken girl he protected in public when nobody else would. The truth about Ethan Mercer unraveled faster than anyone expected. Once Sienna discovered the connection hidden inside the old empire records, Damien's investigation expanded immediately. Layers of financial partnerships, consulting agreements, and shell corporations revealed a pattern that had remained invisible for years. Ethan had quietly positioned himself around multiple conflicts affecting the Kane empire. Never directly, never openly, always from the shadows. The discovery shocked even Damien. For years, he believed the near collapse of his father's business empire came from external competitors. Instead, evidence showed Ethan had been feeding information into existing rivalries, creating distrust, confusion, and division long before Sienna ever entered his life. The obsession had never been accidental. Control was simply Ethan's nature. Relationships, business, power. Everything became a game of ownership. Everything became something to manipulate. But for the first time, the strategy failed. Because Sienna was no longer alone. And because Damien Kane refused to allow history to repeat itself. Inside the syndicate, the remaining pieces quickly fell into place. The trusted associate responsible for leaking information finally faced exposure. Years of loyalty dissolved beneath undeniable evidence. The betrayal hurt more than any business loss. Empires survived competition. Empires survived economic downturns. Betrayal from within was different. Betrayal poisoned foundations. Yet Damien handled the situation differently than many expected. Not with rage, not with revenge, with clarity. The traitor was removed from positions of trust. Every compromise system was rebuilt, and the empire moved forward stronger than before. Loyalty survived. The empire survived. The family survived. For the first time in months, the war ended. Not because enemies disappeared, because truth finally replaced uncertainty. And throughout all of it, Sienna remained beside him. Not behind him, beside him. The distinction mattered. Weeks turned into months. Healing arrived in ways she never expected. The woman who once checked every lock 3 times before sleeping now walked confidently through Damien's estate gardens at sunrise. The woman who apologized before expressing every opinion now challenged executives during meetings and offered insights they genuinely respected. She no longer measured her worth through fear. She no longer lived in survival mode. She was not a victim. She became powerful, not because Damien gave her strength, because she finally recognized the strength she already possessed. The transformation spread throughout the estate. Staff members adored her. Security teams respected her. Even the most intimidating syndicate veterans found themselves strangely protective of the woman who treated everyone with quiet kindness. Without realizing it, Sienna became part of the family, a permanent part. One autumn evening, the lake reflected streaks of gold beneath a setting sun. The estate glowed with warmth. Guests had departed. Meetings were finished. The empire rested. Damien and Sienna stood together on the terrace overlooking the water. The silence felt comfortable, safe, home. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Damien broke the silence. "You changed everything." Sienna laughed softly. "I caused most of your problems. You reminded me why any of this matters." The answer stole her breath. Because it wasn't about the empire, or power, or wealth. It was about purpose. Damien turned toward her fully. For perhaps the first time in his life, the king of Chicago looked completely unguarded. "I spent years protecting an empire," he said quietly. "Then I met someone worth protecting more." Heart-pounding. The world seemed to narrow. Just them. Just this moment. No fear. No danger. No shadows. Only truth. Sienna felt tears gather unexpectedly. Not from sadness. From peace. Because after everything she survived, she finally believed him. Completely. "I trust you," she whispered. The words carried more weight than any declaration of love. Damien understood that immediately. Trust had always been the real battle. Trust was the victory. Trust was everything. And when he gently pulled her close, there was no fear left between them. Only certainty. Months later, the estate hosted a private celebration attended by executives, trusted allies, longtime staff members, and key figures from across the Kane Empire. Nobody formally announced it. Nobody needed to. The acceptance was obvious. Sienna no longer felt like a guest. She belonged, the queen beside the king. Not because Damien placed her there, because she earned her place. Together they stood overlooking the lake while laughter drifted across the gardens. The empire felt stronger. The future felt brighter. For the first time in years, both believed happiness could last. Then, 3 months later, a sealed envelope arrived. No return address. No identifying marks. Only Damien's name written across the front. Inside rested several aging documents connected to a forgotten syndicate conflict from nearly 15 years earlier. A conflict everyone believed had been resolved. A conflict connected to people long gone. At the bottom sat a single photograph. A photograph of a man standing beside one of Damien's oldest enemies. The image had been taken only 2 weeks earlier. On the back, someone had written 6 words. "The real war never ended." Damien's expression darkened. Sienna stood beside him reading the message. Outside, the lake remained calm. Inside, a new storm quietly began to form. Because somewhere beyond the safety of their empire, someone was still watching from the shadows.